The air inside the Washington County Courthouse carried a heaviness that seemed to settle on every shoulder and tighten every breath. It was a crisp autumn morning outside, bright with the promise of changing leaves. But inside, the fluorescent lights flickered against beige walls, stripping the day of warmth. Lawyers in dark suits murmured in hushed tones, shuffling papers that had already been read 100 times. A bailiff leaned against the back wall, scanning the room with practiced boredom. Near the front, a lone reporter adjusted the strap of her camera bag, hoping for a headline that would justify the long hours she'd spent waiting for this case to finally reach its climax. At the very center of the room sat a tiny figure who seemed almost swallowed by the oversized wooden bench. 3-year-old Lily Henderson, dark curls framing a round, solemn face clutched a frayed, cream-colored bunny rabbit so tightly its one remaining ear bent awkwardly toward the floor. She swung her small legs back and forth, not in play, but with a nervous rhythm that matched the ticking of the courtroom clock. Every pair of eyes in the room seemed drawn to her, yet she remained fixed in her own quiet world, watching nothing and everything all at once. Lily had not spoken a single word since the custody hearings began 6 weeks earlier. Not to her mother, not to her father, not to the parade of social workers who had tried, with gentle voices and soft toys, to coax her into conversation. Her silence baffled the professionals assigned to her case. Some thought she was traumatized. Others suspected stubbornness, the silent protest of a child too young to articulate her fears. Whatever the reason, her refusal to speak had turned what should have been a straightforward custody dispute into a tangle of unanswered questions and courtroom theatrics. Judge Margaret Kane, a woman with sharp eyes and a reputation for cutting through theatrics, studied Lily from the bench. She had presided over dozens of bitter custody battles, but this one felt different. The evidence was thin accusations of neglect and anger that left no physical proof, but plenty of emotional scars. Every adult in the room seemed to have an agenda. Only the little girl with the rabbit offered no narrative, no explanation, just a silence that weighed heavier with each passing day. Rachel Henderson, Lily's mother, sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Once known for her easy laugh and the floral perfume she wore even on lazy mornings, Rachel now looked as though the life had been drained from her. Her brown hair was pulled into a tidy knot, but stray strands clung to her damp forehead. She wore a navy dress symbol, respectful, yet the slight tremor in her hands betrayed the storm beneath her composed surface. Every so often, her eyes darted to her daughter, a flicker of hope and heartbreak flashing in her gaze. She longed to reach out, to hold Lily, to whisper the promises she repeated nightly to herself. Mommy will keep you safe. Mommy will never stop fighting. But court decorum demanded stillness, and so she sat frozen, gripping her knees until her knuckles whitened. Across the aisle, Mark Henderson exuded a different energy altogether. Broad-shouldered and impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, he leaned back in his chair with a confidence that bordered on defiance. His jaw was square and clean-shaven, his blonde hair neatly combed. To an outsider, he might have appeared the model father calm, successful, in control. But those who had watched the case unfold knew the accusations that clung to his name like shadows. Rachel claimed Mark's temper could flare without warning, that his charm masked a need to dominate every situation. Mark, in turn, painted Rachel as unstable, prone to emotional outbursts and neglectful habits. Friends from their once picture-perfect marriage had chosen sides, and every hearing had deepened the divide. Today's session was supposed to be routine, a continuation of testimony, another round of expert opinions, another attempt to pry meaning from a child's silence. But beneath the surface, tension buzzed like an electric current. Everyone knew that the final hearing was fast approaching. Judge Kane had made it clear, without compelling evidence, She would have to rely on the limited testimony and the child's own welfare assessments. And though no one said it aloud, everyone knew that Lily's voice, if it ever emerged, could tip the scales in an instant. Lily's guardian ad litem, a soft-spoken woman named Janice Moore, sat beside her at the bench. Janice wore a pale gray suit and a necklace of tiny silver beads that caught the light whenever she moved. She had spent hours with Lily in quiet playrooms, offering crayons, puzzles, even the occasional cookie, hoping to build enough trust for the girl to open up. But Lily remained steadfastly silent, communicating only through careful glances and the occasional squeeze of her bunny. Janice had learned to read those small signals, the slight furrow of a brow, the way Lily's eyes lingered on a doorway, the subtle stiffening of her shoulders when a particular name was mentioned. Janice sensed that the child carried a story, something she could not, or would not, release. As the judge called the court to order, a hush fell over the room. The lawyers for both parents rose in near unison, papers clutched like shields. Rachel's attorney, a middle-aged man with kind eyes but a relentless courtroom presence, began to outline yet another motion for temporary custody. Mark's lawyer countered with an objection, citing lack of evidence. The words volleyed back and forth, legal jargon, emotional appeals, sharp-edged accusations, but none of it seemed to touch Lily. She sat motionless, her gaze fixed on the rabbit's worn ear, swinging her legs with that same steady rhythm. Rachel's heart ached as she watched her daughter retreat further into silence. She wanted to call out, to remind Lily of bedtime stories and morning cuddles, to tell her that no matter what happened in this room, love remained constant. But each time she opened her mouth, the judge's rules of order clamped down like invisible bars. Instead, she could only watch and wait, her eyes silently pleading for the miracle everyone feared might never come. Mark occasionally glanced at his daughter, his expression unreadable. Was it guilt? Fear? Or just the calculation of a man who believed he still held the upper hand? No one could say. His posture remained confident, but when Lily shifted slightly in her seat, clutching the bunny tighter, a fleeting crack appeared, a quick tightening of his jaw, a flicker of something darker beneath the surface. Minutes stretched into an hour as motions were argued and countered. The clock ticked on, each passing second amplifying the tension. Somewhere in the back of the room, the reporter tapped a restless rhythm on her notepad, sensing that the story was bigger than legal filings and custody schedules. Something was building, a pressure too quiet for words, but too powerful to ignore. And then, as the lawyers paused to exchange documents, Lily looked up. Just a small movement, a lift of her chin, but it sent a ripple through those who watched her. Her dark eyes swept the room, lingering briefly on her mother, then on her father, before settling on Judge Kane. For a heartbeat, it seemed as if she might speak. Rachel held her breath. Mark straightened. Janice leaned closer, her silver necklace catching the light. But after a long, measured gaze, Lily lowered her head once more and resumed swinging her legs. Silent as ever, the collective exhale from the courtroom was almost audible. The moment had passed, leaving only questions in its wake. What was the child thinking? What truths lay behind those guarded eyes? No one knew. And as Judge Kane called for a brief recess, one fact settled over the room like a shadow. The smallest person in the courtroom held the greatest power, and she was not ready to give it away. Long before lawyers and judges became part of their vocabulary, Rachel and Mark Henderson were the kind of couple neighbors admired. They had met 7 years ago at a charity 5K in Portland, Oregon, both laughing breathlessly at the finish line when Mark accidentally splashed Gatorade down Rachel's sleeve. Their first dates were full of late-night coffee runs, hiking trips, and endless plans for the future. Friends remembered how Mark would wrap his arm around Rachel in crowded rooms as though shielding her from the world. and how Rachel's laugh, bright and unrestrained, seemed to fill any space they entered. When Lily was born 3 years ago, their small craftsman-style house became a magnet for weekend barbecues and baby showers. Photos from those early days still floated around social media. Mark rocking Lily in a porch swing, Rachel blowing bubbles across the yard as her daughter squealed with delight. It looked unshakable, but love can sour slowly, and when it does, the unraveling often begins in whispers no one hears until it's too late. The first cracks appeared when Mark accepted a promotion that doubled his salary but demanded long hours and frequent travel. At first, Rachel celebrated the opportunity. They could finally afford the nursery furniture they'd admired and the family trips they'd promised each other. But late nights at the office soon became the norm, and when Mark was home, his temper flared more easily than before. He snapped at small inconveniences, a misplaced bill, a cold dinner, then apologized with expensive gifts and warm promises. Rachel, exhausted from caring for an infant and juggling part-time work, told herself the stress would pass. It didn't. Arguments, that once ended with laughter, began to stretch into days of cold silence. Mark accused Rachel of overspending on groceries or failing to keep the house organized, framing his words as helpful advice even as they cut deeper. Rachel, raised in a family where conflict meant slammed doors and bruised egos, tried to keep the peace. She offered soft replies and retreated into chores and bedtime routines, hoping to shield Lily from tension. But children absorb more than adults realize. By her second birthday, Lily had begun to flinch at raised voices, clinging to Rachel whenever Mark's footsteps grew heavy in the hallway. Friends began to notice. Rachel's best friend, Emily, quietly asked if everything was okay after witnessing a sharp exchange at a neighborhood barbecue. Rachel smiled tightly and said Mark was just tired from work. Mark, for his part, charmed visitors with easy jokes and a confident handshake, leaving most outsiders convinced the Hendersons were simply weathering the typical storms of early parenthood. Only those who spent long evenings in their home sensed a shift, a brittle quality in Rachel's smile, a watchfulness in her eyes. 2 years into Mark's promotion, the situation reached a breaking point. One winter night, after a particularly tense dinner, Mark's temper erupted over a misplaced phone charger. His voice thundered through the small house, words spilling out like sparks from a live wire. Rachel shielded Lily behind her legs as Mark paced the living room, fists clenching and unclenching. Though he never touched them, the air felt charged with danger. Later, when he returned from a late drive claiming he needed to cool off, Rachel sat awake in the dim light of the nursery, Lily asleep against her chest, and felt something inside her shift. The next morning, she began researching apartments and custody laws. Leaving was not simple. Mark owned most of their joint assets, and his charm extended to influential friends who might testify on his behalf. Rachel feared that any misstep could cost her more than financial security. It could cost her Lily. She began documenting incidents in a private journal. Dates, times, the exact wording of arguments. She saved text messages where Mark's apologies veered into veiled threats. Every page of her hidden notebook became both a shield and a reminder of the stakes. When she finally filed for separation, she did so quietly, waiting until Mark was away on a business trip to pack her essentials and move into a small 2-bedroom apartment across town. Mark's response was swift and calculated. He hired an aggressive attorney and filed for joint custody, framing Rachel as emotionally unstable and prone to exaggeration. His legal team highlighted her lack of full-time employment, questioning her ability to provide consistent care. Friends who had once celebrated their marriage now found themselves fielding competing phone calls, each side presenting a different version of the truth. Some believed Rachel's quiet descriptions of temper and control. Others sided with Mark's polished narrative of a devoted father blindsided by a vindictive spouse. Through it all, Lily became the silent center of every discussion. Social workers scheduled supervised visits and home evaluations, observing everything from the food in Rachel's refrigerator to the way Mark fastened Lily's car seat. Each report offered small insights, but no definitive answers. Both parents loved their child, that much was clear. But love alone could not guide a legal decision when accusations of emotional harm hovered like invisible smoke. Rachel tried to shield Lily from the turmoil. She filled their new apartment with soft rugs and bright storybooks, creating small pockets of normalcy. Yet she couldn't ignore the way Lily clutched her bunny tighter after visits with Mark, or how she sometimes stared at the door as if expecting someone to burst through it. At night, when Rachel tucked her in, Lily often pressed her face against her mother's neck, breathing softly but refusing to speak. Each wordless hug felt like both comfort and warning. Mark, meanwhile, doubled down on appearances. He arrived at hearings impeccably dressed, presenting photographs of father-daughter outings and receipts for child-friendly activities. He spoke calmly to reporters when they asked about the case, insisting he only wanted what was best for Lily. Yet inside the courthouse, his eyes sometimes hardened when Rachel took the stand, a flash of something sharp and unguarded slipping through his polished exterior. Those fleeting moments unsettled even the most seasoned court observers. The legal battle stretched from weeks into months. Motions were filed and contested. Expert witnesses debated the reliability of a 3-year-old's perceptions. Judge Kane maintained an even tone from the bench, but colleagues noticed the faint furrow of her brow whenever Lily's name was mentioned. The child's silence loomed over every proceeding like an unsolved riddle. Without her voice, the case relied on circumstantial evidence and conflicting testimonies, each side accusing the other of manipulation. Behind closed doors, Rachel wrestled with guilt and fear. She replayed every argument, every warning sign, wondering if she could have left sooner or handled things differently. Mark, in his own way, seemed equally obsessed, sending late-night emails to his attorney and strategizing with friends about the next hearing. Both parents knew that a single moment of clarity, one statement, one piece of evidence could end the stalemate. Neither suspected that the power to break the deadlock rested not with lawyers or judges, but with the smallest person in the room. Lily, oblivious to legal jargon but acutely aware of tension, continued her quiet routine. She colored in waiting rooms, clutched her bunny during supervised visits, and watched the adults around her with wide, searching eyes. Her silence was not empty. It was a fortress. Behind it, thoughts and observations accumulated like pebbles in a jar, each one shaping a truth only she understood. Social workers noted her steady gaze, and the way she seemed to listen, even when no one addressed her directly. They wrote cautious phrases in their reports. Appears observant, demonstrates awareness beyond developmental expectations, but none could predict when or how she might finally share what she knew. As the next hearing approached, tension in both households thickened. Rachel rehearsed answers with her attorney, her stomach knotted with dread. Mark polished his statements, confident that Rachel's lack of verbal evidence would secure his case. Neither parent slept well. Neighbors reported seeing Mark pacing his driveway late at night, phone pressed tightly to his ear. Rachel's friends took turns visiting her apartment, bringing dinners she barely touched. In the midst of this mounting storm, Lily remained the calm eye, quiet, watchful, and impossibly small against the forces swirling around her. And though no one could hear it yet, the faintest tremor of change had begun to stir inside her. Somewhere deep in the guarded silence, a decision was forming, as fragile and unstoppable as the first crack in a sheet of ice. When the moment came, it would not be long arguments or legal documents that decided the family's fate, but the simple power of a child's voice. The November rain arrived early that year, streaking the courthouse windows with long silver trails that blurred the view of the city beyond. Inside the family court building, The air smelled faintly of wet coats and coffee as attorneys and clerks hurried through echoing hallways. Each step toward Judge Kane's courtroom carried the weight of anticipation. This was the third major hearing in the Henderson custody case, and while no single session was supposed to be decisive, everyone sensed that time and patience was running out. Rachel Henderson sat on a stiff wooden bench outside the courtroom, her coat folded neatly across her lap. She had chosen a soft gray sweater that morning, hoping its calm color might steady her own nerves. Across from her, Mark leaned against the wall with the casual stance of a man accustomed to boardroom negotiations. He scrolled through his phone, thumbs moving with precise efficiency, but his eyes flickered occasionally toward Rachel and then toward the small child sitting between them. Lily occupied her own world on the bench beside her court-appointed guardian, Janice Moore. The little girl traced circles along the bunny rabbit's worn ear, her tiny fingers moving in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. Though she appeared absorbed in the soft fabric, her dark eyes darted from her mother to her father with quiet calculation. To the casual observer, she was simply a shy toddler, but Janice had spent enough hours with her to know there was more happening beneath that calm exterior. Lily noticed everything. The quick tightening of Mark's jaw when Rachel cleared her throat, the way Rachel's hands trembled when Mark spoke too loudly. Janice suspected that the child's silence wasn't a symptom of confusion, but of choice. When the bailiff finally called the room to order, the three of them rose in near unison. Rachel straightened her shoulders, despite the knot of anxiety coiled beneath her ribs. Mark adjusted his tie, expression carefully neutral. Lily clutched her bunny and followed Janice's gentle guidance toward the front bench. The click of the judge's gavel echoed like a starting gun. The first hour of testimony unfolded like a well-rehearsed play. Rachel's attorney presented a series of witness statements describing her nurturing nature, her stable apartment, and the routines she maintained for Lily. Morning story time, regular pediatric checkups, healthy meals. Mark's lawyer countered with evidence of Rachel's limited income, highlighting her part-time work schedule and the financial support Mark had consistently provided. Each argument was delivered with professional precision, each objection met with quiet rulings from Judge Kane. But beneath the procedural exchanges, tension rippled like an undertow. The judge's eyes lingered on Lily whenever the conversation turned to her well-being. Social workers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, aware that despite their carefully worded reports, the case lacked the definitive proof needed for a clear decision. Everyone knew that the child herself could resolve the impasse, if only she would speak. Janice had spent weeks trying to encourage Lily to share her thoughts. During supervised play sessions, she offered crayons and coloring books, asking gentle questions about home life. Lily responded with soft smiles or small gestures, pointing to a picture of a house when asked where she lived, handing Janice a red crayon when asked her favorite color, but never uttering a single word about her parents. "She's protective," Janice explained in her latest report. "It's as if she knows that any word could change everything." Mark's attorney seized on that very silence, framing it as proof of Rachel's instability. "The child does not speak in her mother's care," he argued, voice smooth but edged with implication. Perhaps the environment provided by Mrs. Henderson contributes to this ongoing muteness. Rachel's lawyer objected, pointing out that Lily was equally silent during visits with her father. Judge Kane sustained the objection, but jotted a note on her legal pad, her pen scratching softly against the paper dot as testimony dragged into the afternoon. The rain outside intensified. Thunder rolled faintly in the distance, punctuating each new exchange of arguments. Rachel sat rigid, listening to Mark describe himself as a steadfast and loving parent, his tone polished and controlled. She clenched her hands beneath the table to keep from reacting, though inside her chest a storm raged. Each carefully chosen phrase, financial stability, consistent discipline, structured household, felt like a knife twisting in the space where their marriage had once thrived. During a short recess, Rachel retreated to a corner of the hallway, trying to steady her breathing. Emily, her best friend and occasional moral anchor, slipped her a small paper cup of coffee. "You're doing fine," Emily whispered. "The judge can see what's happening. Just hold on." Rachel nodded, but said nothing, eyes drifting toward Lily, who sat quietly with Janice, swinging her small legs as if keeping time with an invisible song. When the court reconvened, Judge Kane addressed the room with a firmness that silenced even the restless reporters in the back. "This case has been ongoing for several months," she began. "It is clear that both parents care deeply for their child. However, the court cannot ignore the psychological toll prolonged uncertainty takes on a minor. I am prepared to set a final hearing date, at which time a permanent custody arrangement will be decided." The words struck like a hammer. Rachel's heart skipped, then raced. A final hearing meant the end of limbo, an end that might not favor her. Mark remained outwardly calm, but a flicker of satisfaction flashed briefly in his eyes. He leaned toward his lawyer, whispering something Rachel couldn't hear. As the gavel sounded to close the day's session, the courtroom began to empty. But Judge Kane called one final name: Miss Lily Henderson. A ripple of surprise moved through the room. Janice rose, gently guiding the child toward the bench. Lily's bunny swung from one hand, its frayed ear brushing against her small shoes. Rachel's breath caught as her daughter approached the witness chair, the very spot where adults had spent hours debating her future. The judge spoke softly, her tone a careful balance of authority and kindness. "Hello, Lily. I just want to say hello. You don't have to answer any questions if you don't want to. We're all here to make sure you're safe and happy." Her words were simple, but the courtroom held its collective breath. Even Mark leaned forward slightly, eyes fixed on his daughter. Lily looked up, meeting the judge's gaze with a seriousness far beyond her 3 years. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she glanced toward Rachel, her eyes softening, before turning briefly to Mark. Her small fingers tightened around the bunny's ear. The room was silent, except for the distant patter of rain. Then, as quickly as she had approached, Lily lowered her gaze and leaned against Janice's arm, offering no words. The judge nodded gently. "That's all right, sweetheart," she said. "Thank you for coming up here today." With a soft smile, she signaled for Janice to escort Lily back to her seat. But as the child stepped down, a faint murmur escaped her lips, so soft that only those closest could hear. Rachel's eyes widened. Mark stiffened. It wasn't a full sentence, not even a clear word, but it was sound. The first sound Lily had made in court. The bailiff announced the next date for the final hearing, and the crowd began to disperse. Yet the energy in the room had shifted. Reporters exchanged quick, excited glances. Lawyers scribbled notes. Janice looked down at Lily with quiet awe. The child had not spoken in full, but something had cracked open a signal. Perhaps that silence would not last forever. Outside, the storm continued to sweep across the city, washing streets and rooftops in cold November rain. Rachel watched the water blur the courthouse windows and felt a strange mix of fear and hope. The next hearing loomed like a cliff edge, and she knew the smallest voice in the room might be the one that finally decided everything. For the first time in months, Rachel sensed that Lily's silence was not merely a barrier. It was a prelude. The morning of the final hearing dawned with a biting December chill that cut through Portland's narrow streets. Outside the courthouse, a heavy gray sky hung low, as if the weather itself sensed the weight of the day. Reporters clustered near the courthouse steps, breath clouding in the cold air, while cameras rested on tripods like patient sentries. For weeks, local newspapers had teased this moment, the custody case everyone is watching. But no headline could capture the quiet dread that settled over the people at the heart of the storm. Rachel Henderson arrived early, her mother at her side. Her coat was buttoned to the throat, her hair pulled into a low knot that matched the careful steadiness in her movements. She clutched a slim folder of documents, though she knew every page by heart. Today's hearing was not just another motion or procedural skirmish. It was the day Judge Kane would decide whether Rachel would become Lily's primary guardian or whether Mark would, win the shared custody he had demanded from the start. Rachel's stomach knotted as she climbed the courthouse steps. She reminded herself to breathe, to walk slowly, to keep her shoulders back. Her daughter needed to see her strong gut. Mark arrived moments later, exuding the same polish that had earned him both corporate promotions and courtroom whispers. He wore a charcoal suit and an expensive watch that gleamed beneath the winter light. Behind him trailed his attorney and a private investigator hired to scrutinize Rachel's parenting. Mark offered the gathered reporters a restrained nod, neither hostile nor welcoming, before disappearing inside. His confidence unsettled Rachel, even as she tried to dismiss it. She had learned the hard way that Mark's calm was not always a reflection of truth, but of strategy. Inside courtroom 3B, the atmosphere felt more like a stage set than a legal chamber. Wooden pews creaked beneath the weight of curious spectators, neighbors, distant relatives, a handful of journalists who sensed a headline worth chasing. At the front, the American flag stood motionless in its corner, its fabric heavy in the stale air. The bailiff checked his watch and scanned the room with the detached patience of someone accustomed to high emotions. Yet even he stole occasional glances toward the small figure seated beside Janice Moore, the court-appointed guardian whose quiet steadiness had become a fixture of these proceedings. Lily sat on the bench, clutching her beloved bunny rabbit, its fabric more worn than ever, the single ear now limp from constant handling. Dressed in a pale blue sweater and tiny black boots, she swung her legs in gentle arcs, humming a soundless tune only she could hear. At 3 years old, she carried herself with an unspoken gravity that belied her age. Her eyes dark, searching, moved from face to face, absorbing every detail. Janice, seated beside her, kept a reassuring hand near the child's shoulder, but offered no words. She had learned that silence, for Lily, was both shield and language. Judge Margaret Kane entered promptly at 9 o'clock. The room rose as the gavel struck, its sharp crack slicing through the low murmur of anticipation. Kane's reputation for fairness and firmness preceded her, and today her expression was carved in stone. She greeted neither side with warmth nor hostility, only the cool professionalism of someone entrusted with decisions that would shape a child's life. Today, she began, her voice resonant in the wood-paneled chamber. This court will hear final arguments and evidence before determining a permanent custody arrangement for the minor child, Lily Henderson. Counsel, you may proceed. Rachel's attorney stood first. His opening remarks were measured, respectful, but layered with quiet urgency. He described Rachel's steady home environment, her consistent care routines, the pediatrician's glowing reports. Photographs of Lily's cheerful bedroom walls painted a soft lavender. Shelves lined with books and stuffed animals were entered into evidence. Witnesses spoke of Rachel's gentleness, her attentiveness, the stability she had created despite financial limitations. Each statement seemed to draw a small nod from Judge Kane, though her eyes remained unreadable. Mark's attorney countered with his own presentation, highlighting Mark's financial security and his desire to provide a structured environment conducive to the child's development. He questioned Rachel's part-time employment and suggested that her emotional volatility, though undocumented, posed a risk. He introduced bank statements, daycare invoices, and photographs of Mark with Lily at community events, evidence designed to paint a portrait of a devoted, reliable father. Mark himself testified with calm precision, never raising his voice, never betraying frustration. To an untrained ear, his words carried the cadence of reason. Rachel listened in silence, fingers twisting in her lap. She could feel Mark's eyes on her, a steady pressure she had come to recognize over the years. A silent message that he still controlled the narrative. Her attorney whispered reassurance, but Rachel's focus remained fixed on Lily, who sat quietly, her gaze moving between her parents with an unreadable calm dot as the morning wore on. The proceedings became a duel of subtleties. Each side presented expert witnesses, psychologists, social workers, even a child development specialist who spoke about the potential harm of prolonged conflict. Yet the most compelling evidence remained unspoken. Every person in the room understood that the child herself held the power to tip the scales. If Lily chose to speak, even a few words could clarify what months of legal sparring had obscured. Shortly before lunch, Judge Kane called for a recess. Spectators shuffled toward the hallway, voices low but buzzing with speculation. Rachel followed her attorney to a quiet corner near the water fountain. "You're doing well," he said softly. "The judge is leaning toward stability, and you provide that. Just keep your composure." Rachel nodded, though her heart pounded in her chest. Across the hall, Mark conferred with his lawyer, his posture still composed, but his eyes sharpened with something colder impatience, perhaps, or the recognition that control was slipping. When court resumed, Kane surprised everyone by addressing the smallest person in the room. "Before we conclude," she said gently, "I'd like to invite Lily to join us at the bench. She is not required to answer any questions. I only wish to greet her and ensure she feels safe here today." The room fell into a hush so complete that the ticking of the courtroom clock seemed deafening. Janice rose slowly, offering Lily her hand. The little girl stood, bunny dangling from her other fist, and followed Janice toward the raised platform. Each step of her tiny boots echoed against the wooden floor, a sound that seemed to stretch time itself. Rachel held her breath. Mark's eyes narrowed slightly, though his face remained carefully neutral. Lily climbed into the witness chair with Janice's gentle assistance. Judge Kane leaned forward, her expression softening. "Hello, Lily," she said in a voice both warm and steady. "You look very nice today. I like your bunny. Does he have a name?" For a moment, Lily only stared at the judge, her dark eyes luminous beneath the overhead lights. The bunny's frayed ear brushed her cheek as she shifted in her seat. The room remained silent, every adult waiting for the impossible. Then, to the faintest astonishment, Lily gave a small nod. It wasn't speech, but it was acknowledgement, a crack in the fortress of silence. "That's a lovely bunny," the judge continued softly. "You don't have to say anything if you don't want to. I just wanted to meet you." Lily blinked, her gaze steady. Then she turned her head slightly, first toward Rachel, then toward Mark. Something unreadable flickered across her face, a calculation far older than her years. Her tiny fingers tightened around the bunny's ear. The hush in the courtroom deepened, a living thing that pressed against every chest. And then, without warning, Lily opened her mouth. The sound was so soft at first that some thought they imagined it. A single syllable, tentative yet clear, floated into the air. Janice's eyes widened. Rachel felt her heart seize. Mark leaned forward, as if proximity might control the outcome. The word was incomplete, a fragment more than a statement, but it carried the unmistakable ring of intent. Judge Kane's expression remained calm, but her pen paused mid-note. "Take your time, sweetheart," she said gently. Lily's lips moved again, forming another faint sound, a second syllable that joined the first, like the beginning of a melody. Two small sounds. Two small words. The child who had guarded her voice for months was no longer silent. Gasps rippled through the gallery, followed by a charged stillness that seemed to freeze the very air. Rachel's eyes filled with tears she dared not wipe away. Mark's carefully constructed composure faltered, a flicker of alarm breaking through his calm mask. The gavel struck lightly, but the sound barely registered. Everyone in the room knew that something irreversible had just begun. Two small words had broken months of silence, carrying a power far greater than their syllables. The final hearing was not over, but the balance of the case had shifted in a single heartbeat, and everyone present felt the ground tilt beneath them. For a breathless moment, no one moved. The wooden benches of courtroom 3B seemed to absorb the electricity in the air as Lily's voice, soft, delicate, but undeniable, hung like a fragile thread over the silent room. Her tiny mouth had formed two unmistakable words. They were simple, childlike words, not the complex accusations or detailed explanations the lawyers had fought to uncover for months. And yet, their meaning struck with the force of a thunderclap. "Daddy?" "Stop." The syllables were barely more than a whisper, but they sliced through the courtroom like a blade. A collective gasp rippled across the gallery, followed by a ringing silence so complete that even the overhead lights seemed to hum louder. The bailiff froze in mid-step. Reporters clutched their pens, eyes wide. For the first time since the case began, the 3-year-old at the center of the storm had spoken freely, without prompting, without fear. And what she chose to say was both devastating and clarifying. Rachel's hands flew to her mouth, stifling a sob. Tears blurred her vision as the weight of those two words sank in. She felt the air rush from her lungs, as if someone had opened a hidden door to a storm she had spent years bracing against. She wanted to run to her daughter, to gather her up and tell her she was safe, but the judge's raised hand held her in place. Mark, seated across the aisle, flinched as though struck. His carefully polished composure cracked in an instant. His jaw tightened. A flicker of panic flashed in his eyes before he caught himself. For weeks, he had maintained an air of confident innocence, leaning on charm and logic to counter Rachel's quiet warnings about his temper. But a child's plea 3 years old and uncoached required no cross-examination. It was raw, unfiltered truth, and every adult in the room felt the ground shift beneath it. Judge Kane leaned forward slightly, her usually steady eyes softening but sharpening all at once. "Lily," she said gently, "thank you for speaking to us. You are very brave." She let the words settle before continuing in a careful tone. "Would you like to tell me anything else, sweetheart?" "Only if you want to." Lily shook her head, curls bouncing against her cheeks. Her small hand gripped her bunny tighter, knuckles whitening around the worn fabric. It was clear she had given all she intended to give. 2 words, that was all she needed. Kane nodded, offering a reassuring smile that carried more gratitude than authority. "You've done wonderfully," the judge said softly. "Janice, please escort her back to her seat." Janice Moore, the guardian ad litem, moved slowly, as though afraid to disturb the delicate moment. She helped Lily down from the witness chair and guided her back to the bench. As they passed, Rachel caught her daughter's eyes and mouthed a silent, "I love you." Lily responded with a small nod, her expression calm, almost serene, as though the simple act of speaking had lifted a weight far heavier than her years. The courtroom, however, was anything but calm. Rachel's attorney rose immediately, voice steady but carrying a tremor of urgency. "Your Honor, the child's statement speaks for itself. For months we have expressed concern over Mr. Henderson's temper, concerns that have been met with denials and counterclaims. We now have the most credible testimony possible, the child herself, unprompted, asking her father to stop. We respectfully request that this court take immediate protective measures." Mark's attorney shot to his feet, protest ready. "Objection, Your Honor. The child is 3 years old." Her words, while heartfelt, cannot be taken as a definitive accusation. Children this age often. Judge Kane's gavel cracked sharply against the block. "Counselor, You will not diminish the voice of this child in my courtroom. Her tone, calm but unyielding, silenced the room. While the court is fully aware of developmental limitations at this age, it is equally aware that a spontaneous plea of this nature carries significant weight. Your objection is noted, but overruled. Mark shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward Rachel before settling on the judge. The easy confidence he had worn like armor now looked brittle, almost desperate. He began to speak, voice tight. Your Honor, I would never harm my daughter. Whatever she meant by those words, Mr. Henderson, Judge Kane interrupted, her voice cutting through his defense. You will have the opportunity to clarify your position shortly. For now, remain seated. The gallery buzzed with whispers, reporters scribbling furiously. The words, "Daddy, stop," traveled from bench to bench like a lightning strike, igniting speculation about what Lily might have witnessed or endured. The case, once a complex tug-of-war over custody schedules and financial stability, had transformed in an instant into a question of safety. Rachel sat frozen, her heart hammering in her chest. Relief and fear battled within her. Relief that Lily had finally spoken, fear of what might follow. She had long suspected that Lily's silence was a form of self-protection, but hearing those words aloud confirmed what her instincts had whispered in sleepless nights. Her little girl had not been silent because she had nothing to say. She had been silent because the truth was too heavy to carry until this very moment. Judge Kane called a brief recess to allow tempers to settle and emotions to cool, but the hallway outside the courtroom erupted into controlled chaos. Reporters crowded the exits, eager for quotes. Social workers huddled in tense discussion, their professional neutrality cracking under the emotional weight. Rachel's attorney pulled her aside, voice low but urgent. This changes everything, he said. The judge will almost certainly order an emergency evaluation. It's the closest thing to a direct plea for protection we could hope for. Stay calm, stay steady. This is a turning point. Across the hall, Mark argued in hushed tones with his lawyer, his face a mask of forced control. He gestured sharply, his usual smooth gestures replaced by quick, agitated movements. Though no one could hear their exact words, the message was clear. His carefully constructed narrative was collapsing, and he knew it. When the court reconvened, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. The tension was no longer the slow, grinding weight of legal procedure. It was the sharp, crackling energy of revelation. Judge Kane's eyes swept the room before settling on Mark. Mr. Henderson, she began, her voice measured but unyielding. This court takes the child's words with utmost seriousness. Effective immediately, I am issuing a temporary order restricting unsupervised contact until a full psychological evaluation and home assessment are completed. Further hearings will be scheduled once those reports are available. Mark opened his mouth to protest, but the gavel struck again, silencing him before he could speak. The decision was made. The tide had turned. Rachel felt tears spill freely down her cheeks, but this time they were tears of release, not despair. For months, she had fought to protect Lily with little more than instinct and fragments of evidence. Now, her daughter's own voice had become the proof no expert could dismiss. 2 small words had succeeded where affidavits and testimony had failed. As the courtroom emptied, Lily remained calm, swinging her legs as Janice zipped up her tiny coat. When Rachel approached, Lily reached up wordlessly, and Rachel scooped her into her arms, burying her face in the child's soft hair. You were so brave, she whispered, her voice trembling. So brave. Lily rested her head on her mother's shoulder, the bunny squished between them. Mommy, she murmured, almost too softly to hear. Can we go home now? Rachel held her tighter, heart swelling with a fierce mix of love and gratitude. Yes, baby, she whispered. We can go home. Behind them, Mark remained seated at the defense table, His shoulders hunched in a way that betrayed the collapse of his carefully managed facade. The man who had entered the courtroom with quiet arrogance now looked small beneath the cold glow of the overhead lights. The battle he had believed he could win with charm and strategy had been undone by the soft, unwavering truth of a child's plea. Outside, cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, but Rachel shielded Lily with her coat, guiding her swiftly past the chaos. The winter air bit at her cheeks, but she barely felt it. In her arms was the only warmth she needed, the living proof that even the smallest voice could cut through the loudest lies. 2 words had changed everything, and nothing in their lives would ever be the same again. The courthouse doors swung open, and the winter air rushed in like a cleansing wave, biting cold against overheated skin. But the chill outside was nothing compared to the storm brewing within. By the time Rachel stepped into the corridor with Lily in her arms, the building had become a hive of motion. Reporters surged forward, microphones raised like weapons, voices overlapping in a frenzy of questions. "Rachel, do you have a statement? What did Lily mean by those words? Is Mark a danger to his daughter?" Rachel kept her head low, her coat forming a protective shield around Lily's small body. The little girl buried her face against her mother's neck, her bunny pressed tight between them. Janice Moore, the guardian ad litem, flanked Rachel like a seasoned bodyguard, her calm voice cutting through the chaos. "No questions at this time. Please step back." The hallway echoed with camera shutters and the muffled roar of unanswered curiosity. Behind them, the courtroom emptied in tense waves. Attorneys whispered in sharp, urgent tones. Social workers exchanged worried glances. Even the bailiff, normally immune to spectacle, paused to watch the small family disappear down the stairwell. Everyone understood that what had unfolded inside courtroom 3B was no ordinary custody dispute. A 3-year-old child had shattered weeks of legal arguments with 2 words, "Daddy, stop." In doing so, had shifted the entire trajectory of the case. Mark Henderson emerged minutes later, his once impeccable composure visibly frayed. His attorney, a seasoned litigator with a reputation for control, kept a firm hand on his client's arm, steering him past reporters. But Mark's eyes betrayed the tension beneath his mask. Gone was the polished charm that had carried him through previous hearings. His gaze darted, restless, as if searching for a crack in the reality that had just collapsed around him. A reporter called out a pointed question, "Mr. Henderson, do you deny your daughter's plea?" But Mark gave no answer. His silence only deepened the speculation. Outside, television vans idled with satellite dishes aimed skyward, ready to beam the story across the country. Within an hour, the first breaking news alerts flashed across phone screens. 3-year-old speaks in custody case, says, "Daddy, stop." By afternoon, the video clip of Judge Kane's emergency ruling had gone viral. Commentators debated the legal weight of a toddler's testimony. Child psychologists appeared on cable panels, parsing the possible meanings of Lily's words. Social media ignited with hashtags. Hashtag Daddy Stop, hashtag Protect Lily, hashtag Tiny Voice Big Truth. The story was no longer confined to a Portland courtroom. It had become a national conversation. While the world dissected her daughter's plea, Rachel's focus remained singular, keeping Lily safe. Janice guided them through a back exit to avoid the crowd and into a waiting vehicle arranged by Child Protective Services. The agency had moved swiftly after the judge's ruling, placing immediate safeguards around mother and child. A temporary restraining order barred Mark from unsupervised contact. A court-appointed psychologist was scheduled to conduct an urgent evaluation. For the first time in months, Rachel felt the faint stirrings of relief. The battle was far from over, but for once, the system seemed to be working in their favor. As the car wound through quiet side streets, Rachel stroked Lily's hair, marveling at the calm radiating from her tiny frame. "You were so brave today," she whispered. "Mommy is so proud of you." Lily didn't answer. Her thumb found its way to her mouth, her bunny clutched tight against her chest. But her eyes, dark and steady, met Rachel's in the rearview mirror. There was no fear in them, only the quiet strength of a child who had done something enormous and somehow understood its importance. Back at the courthouse, the ripples of Lily's words continued to spread. Judge Kane remained in chambers long after the hearing, reviewing emergency protocols and scheduling follow-up hearings. She requested expedited background checks, psychological assessments, and supervised visitation arrangements. "We are dealing with a very young child," she reminded the assembled court staff. "But her voice carries weight, and our duty is to ensure her safety above all else." Her measured directives belied the urgency that hung in the air. Everyone involved knew that the next few days would be critical. Mark retreated to his attorney's office as reporters camped outside the building. Inside the polished conference room, his control began to unravel. "She's 3 years old," he snapped, pacing the length of the carpet. 3. She doesn't know what she's saying. His attorney, a man accustomed to difficult clients, chose his words carefully. "The judge will not dismiss her statement, Mark. Not after what happened today. We need to focus on the psychological evaluation. Cooperation is your best path forward." Mark stopped pacing, his jaw tightening. "Cooperation? After she turned my own daughter against me?" He slammed a fist against the table, the sound sharp in the quiet room. The attorney said nothing, but the unspoken truth hung heavy between them. Mark's anger, so easily triggered, was precisely what the court feared most. That night, Portland's local news led with dramatic footage of the day's hearing. Viewers across the country watched the clip of a tiny girl clutching a bunny, her soft voice barely audible as she spoke 2 devastating words. Legal analysts debated the likelihood of criminal charges, though none had yet been filed. Child advocacy groups praised Judge Kane's swift action. And in living rooms everywhere, parents held their children a little closer, reminded that even the smallest voices deserve to be heard. Meanwhile, Rachel settled Lily into a temporary apartment arranged by Child Services. The space was modest, a clean 1-bedroom with a worn couch and a view of the Willamette River, but to Rachel, it felt like a fortress. As she tucked Lily into bed, the child's breathing slowed into the rhythmic cadence of sleep. Rachel watched her for a long time, marveling at the quiet courage of the little girl, who had spoken when it mattered most. Her own emotions, however, remained a storm. Relief warred with anxiety. Mark was not yet out of their lives. The psychological evaluation, the supervised visits, the next round of hearings, all loomed ahead. And there was the deeper question that haunted her when the room grew silent. What exactly had prompted Lily's plea? Rachel's worst fears, whispered possibilities she wasn't ready to confront. "Daddy, stop, what?" A raised voice? A frightening game? Something darker? The words were both a revelation and a riddle. Across town, Mark sat alone in his high-rise apartment, the glow of his phone illuminating a face tight with frustration. Messages from friends and colleagues flooded in, some sympathetic, others cautiously distant. The news coverage was relentless. He scrolled through social media, reading strangers' judgments of his character, each post tightening the coil of anger in his chest. He thought of his daughter, of her soft voice, and felt a surge of something he couldn't name. Hurt, betrayal, fear. For the first time, the outcome of the custody battle no longer felt like a contest he could win with charm and resources. The narrative was slipping beyond his control. Late that night, Judge Kane drafted an official statement for the press. "While I cannot comment on specific details," it read, "today's hearing underscores the importance of listening to children, no matter their age. The safety and well-being of the child will remain this court's highest priority." It was a careful message, devoid of sensationalism, but its implication was clear. The voice of a 3-year-old had changed the trajectory of an entire legal case. By morning, national networks picked up the story. News anchors framed it as a turning point in family law. Talk show hosts invited experts to discuss the credibility of young children in court. Hashtags continued to trend. Donations poured into child advocacy organizations. And through it all, Lily remained blissfully unaware of the storm she had set in motion. To her, it was just another morning. She awoke to the smell of pancakes and the sound of her mother's soft humming, safe for now in a world that finally seemed to hear her. For Rachel, the fight was not over, but the path forward had changed. Her daughter's voice, once locked behind silence, had become their greatest ally. No affidavit or expert testimony could carry the weight of those 2 words. They were more than a plea. They were a command to the adults who had failed to protect her. Daddy Stop was not just a cry. It was a verdict. And though the legal system still had steps to follow, everyone who had been in courtroom 3B that day, judge, lawyers, reporters, and strangers alike, knew one truth with absolute certainty. The smallest voice in the room had spoken the loudest, and nothing would ever be the same again. The final hearing came only 5 days after Lily's quiet plea, yet it felt as if weeks had passed. In those few days, Portland had transformed into a city buzzing with speculation. Headlines screamed updates about the case. Radio shows debated the meaning of Daddy Stop, and television pundits dissected every legal angle. Outside the courthouse on the morning of the verdict, satellite trucks lined the street like silent giants. Reporters jostled for position, while photographers tested their flashes in the winter gloom. The tension in the air was as sharp as the bite of the cold. Rachel arrived early, her attorney at her side, dressed in a navy suit that made her look both professional and unyieldingly composed. Despite the sleepless nights and the constant hum of media coverage, her face carried a new steadiness. She had been living under emergency protective orders for less than a week, but it was enough time to sense the difference in Lily. Her daughter's sleep had deepened, her small shoulders relaxed more easily, and her laughter, rare in the months before, had begun to return. Rachel clung to those fragile signs of safety as she prepared to face the courtroom once more. Janice Moore, the guardian ad litem, met them at the security checkpoint with a reassuring nod. "Remember," she whispered, "the judge has already heard what matters most. Today is about confirming protections, not relitigating the past." Rachel exhaled slowly, allowing those words to settle like a shield. Mark entered minutes later, flanked by his attorney. His appearance remained polished, dark suit, neat tie, but the cracks beneath the surface were impossible to miss. The restless energy that had once fueled his quiet confidence now betrayed him in small, involuntary movements. The tightening of his jaw, the impatient tap of his foot, the flicker of his eyes toward every camera lens. In the days since Lily's testimony, the public narrative had turned against him. Editorials questioned his fitness as a parent. Social media hashtags, #DaddyStop, #ProtectLily, painted him as a villain before any formal ruling. He knew the courtroom was no longer a neutral arena. It was a stage on which his character, not just his custody rights, would be judged. Inside courtroom 3B, the air felt heavier than before, thick with anticipation. Spectators filled every bench, including several faces from previous hearings, neighbors, distant relatives, and a handful of national journalists who had flown in to witness the conclusion of a case that had captured the country's attention. The bailiff called the court to order, and the room rose as Judge Margaret Kane entered, her black robe trailing like a shadow behind her. The judge surveyed the room, her expression composed but solemn. "We are here to render a final decision in the matter of Henderson versus Henderson regarding the custody of minor child Lily Henderson," she began. Her measured voice carried across the room, steady and deliberate. "Over the past several months, this court has considered testimony reviewed evidence, and weighed the recommendations of professionals. Most recently, we heard a spontaneous statement from the child herself, words that, while brief, cannot and will not be ignored. Mark's attorney rose first, attempting one final defense. "Your Honor," he began, "while we respect the seriousness of the child's words, we maintain that a 3-year-old cannot fully comprehend the implications of her statements. We urge the court to prioritize the proven stability and resources my client offers." Rachel's attorney followed with a quiet but piercing rebuttal. "Your Honor, no one disputes that a 3-year-old speaks in simple terms. But simplicity does not equal confusion." In her own language, Lily told this court what she needed: for her father to stop. "We cannot, in good conscience, overlook a child's plea for safety." Judge Kane listened without interruption, her gaze moving between the two lawyers like a metronome marking time. When they finished, she folded her hands and leaned slightly forward. The room fell silent, the only sound the faint ticking of the courtroom clock. "This case," she began, "has been challenging not only because of the conflicting testimonies, but because of the age of the child involved. Young children do not always have the vocabulary to articulate their experiences. However, they do have the ability to communicate distress, fear, and the need for protection." Lily Henderson's spontaneous statement, "Daddy, stop," was made without coercion and carries the unmistakable weight of a request for safety. It is the duty of this court to honor that request. A ripple of tension spread through the room. Mark shifted in his seat, his attorney placing a cautionary hand on his arm. Rachel gripped the edge of the table, her breath catching. "Effective immediately," Judge Kane continued, "full physical and legal custody of Lily Henderson is awarded to her mother, Rachel Henderson. Mr. Mark Henderson will be granted supervised visitation only, subject to the completion of a psychological evaluation and ongoing therapy. The supervision will remain in place until the court is satisfied that visitation poses no risk to the child's emotional or physical well-being." The words hung in the air, heavy and irrevocable. A collective exhale followed, some sighs of relief, others of resignation. Rachel felt her knees weaken as a flood of emotions surged through her. Gratitude, exhaustion, and a fierce protectiveness that burned like fire. She squeezed her attorney's hand, tears threatening to spill. Across the aisle, Mark sat frozen. His face, once an impenetrable mask of control, tightened into something harder to read: shock, anger, perhaps even fear. He started to speak, but the gavel struck sharply, silencing him before a single word escaped. "This ruling is final," Judge Kane said firmly. "Mr. Henderson, you have the right to appeal, but you will respect the conditions set forth today. Any violation will result in immediate legal consequences." The hearing ended with the gavel's decisive crack. The bailiff called for order as spectators erupted in hushed conversations. Reporters scrambled for the door, racing to file breaking news updates. Cameras waited outside to capture reactions, but inside the courtroom, a quieter drama unfolded. Rachel turned to Janice first, embracing her with a shaky breath. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible over the din. Janice squeezed her hand. "It was Lily who spoke the loudest," she replied softly. She gave the court what it needed. Rachel then knelt beside her daughter, who sat patiently on the bench, clutching her bunny. "It's over, sweetheart," she said, brushing a curl from Lily's forehead. "We can go home now." Lily nodded, her dark eyes calm, as if she had understood the verdict all along. "No more court?" she asked. Rachel smiled through her tears. No more court. As mother and daughter exited through the side door, flashes from outside cameras lit the hallway like a stuttering storm. The security team cleared a path, but reporters still shouted questions. "Rachel, how do you feel? Will Mark appeal? Do you fear retaliation?" Rachel kept her gaze forward, Lily held tight against her chest. For the first time in months, she did not feel the need to defend or explain. The law had spoken. Her child's voice had been heard. Mark lingered in the courtroom long after it emptied, his attorney beside him, murmuring about next steps and possible appeals. But Mark barely listened. His mind replayed the tiny sound of his daughter's voice, those two words echoing like a verdict far more powerful than any legal ruling. "Daddy, stop." It was not just a plea. It was a boundary he had failed to respect, a mirror reflecting the consequences of his actions, or perhaps of the anger he had always denied. Outside, the world reacted in real time. News networks interrupted regular programming to broadcast the verdict. Social media exploded with celebratory messages for Rachel and Lily. Child advocacy organizations praised the decision as a milestone for giving weight to the voices of very young children. The hashtag #LilySpeaks began trending within minutes, a digital echo of the courage that had reshaped a family's future. By the time Rachel and Lily reached the quiet apartment arranged by Child Protective Services, the city's chaos felt distant. The sky had darkened into a deep winter blue, the first stars faint above the Willamette River. Inside, the apartment smelled of chamomile tea and fresh laundry. Rachel locked the door, slid down to the floor, and held her daughter close. "You were so brave," Rachel whispered again, her voice trembling. "Do you know that?" Lily looked up, eyes soft but steady. "I just wanted it to stop," she said simply. Rachel's heart clenched. She kissed her daughter's forehead and pulled her into a tighter embrace. "It has stopped, baby. You're safe now." "We're safe." In the quiet that followed, the sounds of the city faded into the background. The legal battle was over. The headlines would continue for days, maybe weeks. But inside that small apartment, there was only the steady rhythm of a mother's heartbeat and a child's slow, peaceful breathing, a sound more powerful than any gavel, more lasting than any verdict. The morning after the verdict, Portland awoke beneath a pale winter sun. For the first time in months, Rachel didn't have to rush to meet an attorney or prepare court documents. The alarm clock still buzzed at 7, but instead of panic, there was only quiet. Lily padded into the kitchen in her bunny print pajamas, clutching the same stuffed rabbit that had accompanied her through every hearing. "Mommy, pancakes?" she asked, eyes bright with the unburdened excitement of an ordinary child. Rachel smiled, a real, unguarded smile. "Pancakes," she confirmed. Flour dusted her fingers as she stirred the batter, marveling at the sound of Lily's easy chatter about her favorite cartoon, about the snow outside, about absolutely nothing to do with courtrooms or lawyers. For the first time in a long time, breakfast smelled like cinnamon and safety instead of fear. Yet outside their apartment, the story was far from over. News outlets across the country had seized on the drama. Morning shows replayed courtroom sketches, scrolling the words "Daddy, stop" across their screens in bold, unforgettable letters. Editorials debated the implications of a 3-year-old influencing a legal decision. Some called it a victory for children's rights. Others worried about setting a precedent. But for Rachel, the noise beyond her door was irrelevant. What mattered was that her daughter's small, clear voice had changed everything, and that voice needed nurturing, not exploitation. She turned down interview requests, ignored persistent reporters, and focused instead on building a world where Lily's words could remain her own. Janice Moore, the Guardian ad litem, visited a few days later for a follow-up welfare check. She found Lily happily drawing stars and flowers on a sheet of paper. "She looks lighter," Janice observed, her professional calm softening into a smile. "She is," Rachel replied. "It's like she can finally breathe." Janice nodded. Children know when the storm is past. They may not explain it, but they feel it. Lily looked up from her drawing. "I drew us," she announced, pointing to 2 stick figures beneath a bright yellow sun. That's me and Mommy. We're happy now." Rachel's throat tightened. "It's beautiful," she said, kissing the top of Lily's head. As weeks turned into months, life slowly stitched itself into something resembling normal. Lily began attending a small preschool where teachers described her as curious and kind, though occasionally quiet when strangers raised their voices. Rachel found part-time work at a community library, a place filled with warmth and the soft hush of turning pages. Each day, she walked Lily to school, their hands clasped against the chill of early spring mornings. Each night, she tucked her daughter into bed with the assurance that no gavel, no headline, no shadow from the past could intrude on their small sanctuary. Mark's path was more complicated. Ordered to undergo therapy and supervised visitation, he initially resisted every requirement. Court-appointed counselors noted his defensiveness, his tendency to deflect responsibility. But over time, perhaps, worn down by the consequences, perhaps shaken by the unmistakable truth of his daughter's words, something began to shift. During the first supervised visit, Mark arrived stiff and formal. Lily clung to Rachel's leg, hesitant to cross the playroom threshold. He crouched to her level, voice softer than Rachel had heard in years. "Hi, Bug," he said, using the old nickname. Lily stared for a long moment before stepping forward, bunny in hand. The visits remained brief and carefully monitored, but they marked the beginning of something tentative, a recognition that love must be built on trust, not fear. Whether Mark would ever earn unsupervised time remained uncertain, but the process forced him to confront the truth Lily had so innocently delivered. Meanwhile, the case continued to ripple through the legal community. Law schools cited it in lectures about the weight of a child's testimony. Child advocacy groups used it to push for reforms and how courts interpret the voices of very young children. Judges debated protocols for evaluating spontaneous statements. Across the country, parents in custody battles read about Lily and wondered whether their own children might one day hold similar power. But inside Rachel's apartment, none of that mattered on a day-to-day level. What mattered was bedtime stories, grocery runs, and the simple act of listening. Rachel made a quiet promise to herself. Never again would she dismiss the small signals of discomfort or fear. Lily had taught her that even the shortest phrases, 2 words, whispered in a courtroom, could carry a universe of meaning. One rainy Saturday, several months after the verdict, Rachel and Lily visited the Portland Children's Museum. They wandered through the exhibits, Lily squealing with delight at the water play station. At one point, they settled into a quiet reading nook. Lily chose a picture book and climbed onto her mother's lap. "Mommy," she said suddenly, "remember the big room with the judge?" Rachel's heart skipped, but she nodded. "I remember." Lily leaned against her. "I was scared." "I know, sweetheart." Rachel stroked her hair. "But you were so brave. You told the truth, and it helped keep us safe." Lily thought for a moment. "Did the judge hear me?" "She heard you," Rachel said softly. "Everyone heard you." Lily smiled faintly and returned to her book, satisfied with the answer. In that small exchange, Rachel felt the full weight of what her daughter had accomplished, not just in the courtroom, but in reclaiming her own sense of security. Outside the museum, spring had finally settled over the city. Cherry blossoms bloomed along the sidewalks, their pink petals scattering like confetti across the damp pavement. As Rachel and Lily walked beneath the canopy of trees, the air smelled of rain and new beginnings. Rachel paused, taking in the sight of her daughter skipping ahead, laughter echoing through the quiet street. She thought of the countless headlines that had defined their story. 3-year-old breaks silence. 2 words that changed everything. But those headlines captured only a fraction of the truth. The real story wasn't just about a courtroom or a verdict. It was about resilience, about a child who refused to stay silent, a mother who learned to trust her instincts, and a family forced to confront painful realities. Months later, when the media attention finally faded, Rachel received a letter from a mother in another state. The woman wrote that she had followed the case and, because of Lily's bravery, had found the courage to leave an unsafe relationship. "Your daughter's voice gave me strength," the letter concluded. Rachel read it twice, tears spilling onto the page. That night, as she tucked Lily into bed, she whispered a quiet thank you to the universe, for Janice, for Judge Kane, and most of all for the tiny voice that had spoken louder than anyone imagined. Lily stirred sleepily, reaching for her bunny. "Night-night, Mommy," she murmured. "Good night, my brave girl," Rachel replied. "You changed the world." Lily's breathing slowed, soft and steady. Rachel sat beside her for a long time, watching the gentle rise and fall of her chest, feeling the steady beat of a future no longer overshadowed by fear. Outside, the city lights glowed against the night sky, their reflections shimmering in the Willamette River. Somewhere beyond those lights, debates continued, laws evolved, and lives were quietly altered by the echoes of a child's simple plea. But inside the small bedroom where Lily dreamed, there was only peace, the lasting legacy of two small words that proved even the quietest voice can reshape destiny.